Why hello there, and welcome back to Tabletop Ferox. And in this episode, we'll be getting into the Supernatural RPG.
The what? Role-playing game. Right.
Supernatural role-playing game, no the or punctuation anywhere in that title, was released in 2009 by Margaret Weis Productions, producers of such other games as the Marvel, Smallville, Battlestar Galactica, Serenity, and Firefly role-playing games, just to give you kind of an idea of where that company's specialty happens to be. And is of course based on popular ghost shooting television series Supernatural, which at the time had recently wrapped up its 4th season. So in order to prepare for this review, I watched the first 4 seasons of Supernatural to put myself in the mindset of someone who was a fan of the show when the game came out in August of 2009. So now that that's all out of the way, I guess let's get to hunting. Players in Supernatural, of course, take on the role of hunters, and a hunter, as appears in Supernatural, is kind of an interesting position because it is very similar to a Dungeons & Dragons adventurer in that it requires a very specific combination of combat skills, lore, diplomacy, and deception. The main difference being that in Dungeons & Dragons, after you kill the werewolf, the townspeople cheer and hand you a handsome reward, whereas in Supernatural, after you kill the werewolf, you have to get out of town really quick before someone finds the body and you get charged for murder. So they are similar but different. So let's make us a hunter. So the first thing that needs to be decided is whether the character is a rookie, veteran, or seasoned, which determines how many points we get to spend on the various things. And normally this would be set by the game master, but we don't have one of those here, so let's just say the character is a rookie. Maybe they've shot a few ghosts, but haven't really done anything epic, like fist fighting a mermaid. And being a rookie gives us 42 attribute points, 62 skill points, and 0 trait points. Characters have 6 attributes: agility, strength, vitality, alertness, intelligence, and willpower. And as is everything in this system, attributes are defined with dice, ranging from a D2 to a D12 and sometimes higher, and cost a number of attribute points equal to the value of the die. So buying one attribute at D6 costs 6 points, and just for convenience, let's put a D6 in each attribute for 6 times 6 equals 36 points, which leaves us with 6 points. So let's bump up agility, intelligence, and willpower to a D8 for 2 more points each, and that's all of our attribute points. Then we have some derived attributes: initiative, which is agility plus alertness, endurance, which is vitality plus willpower, life points, which is the maximum values of the vitality and willpower dice, and resistance, which is vitality plus vitality. And you might be wondering why we really needed to write most of those things down when they are generally just the values of 2 attributes written together, and one is literally just the same attribute twice, and that is a very good question. Anyway, moving on to skills. There are 23 general skills, each of which has multiple specialties, and points put into the general skill apply to every specialty within it, but also have a maximum value of D6. So a D6 in guns costs 6 points, but then a D10 in pistols only costs another 4 points, and a D8 in shotguns only another 2, since they both start from that D6 of the general gun skill. So let's just go ahead and spend the rest of those points, then move on to traits, which come in 2 different flavors: the positive assets and the negative complications. And according to the book, you buy assets with trait points. Unless you're a rookie, because they get 0 trait points. But the book also says that every character has to take at least 1 asset and 1 complication, so presumably they mean that rookies just don't get any extra points to spend on assets, but still must take the required 1 asset and 1 complication. So let's go ahead and take Phobia Spiders as a D4 complication, even though that is basically asking the GM to put in a giant spider adventure, which gives us 4 extra trait points, which we can then spend on Tech Expert as a D4 asset. And basically the way that, well, most traits work is the asset die is added to the relevant rolls, and the complication die to relevant difficulties, and much like other attributes and skills, most are available at various dice levels. So, for example, we would add our Tech Expert D4 to any rolls using technology, and our Phobia D4 to the difficulty of any tests where there are spiders involved. But now on to our character's gear, which means we must first determine their lifestyle, which is basically how well off they are financially. There are 5 lifestyle levels, each of which is defined with a die, D2 through D10, which I don't think you ever actually use. Like, I can definitely imagine a way where that die could be used, but they don't seem to do that in the book, so not sure on that one. Anyway, the book says that Working Stiff is the default for hunters, so let's just go with that. And now for our gear, it is a little unclear. There is no starting gold or anything like that, you just kinda take what you want, unless the GM says you can't, which does kind of fit with the show as they don't focus that much on the acquisition of items, more so just, oh no, we need a bronze dagger inlaid with a single Nile crocodile tooth, then cut to them having that thing. The only actual indication of value is that each item has a suggested lifestyle, which suggests which level of lifestyle character should be able to access said items. Although some of those things do seem a bit off, since things like an EMF meter and silver bullets are suggested lifestyle D6, but the book also says, as mentioned earlier, that the default lifestyle for a hunter is D4, and those are things that pretty much every hunter has, especially the silver bullets. Like, let's be honest here, Sam and Dean have fired off thousands of dollars worth of silver in the show, and they just don't really draw attention to it. Anyway, our imaginary GM has approved all of this gear, including some items that technically aren't actually listed in the gear section, but that is something for a bit later, and this character is done. And there we have it, the character creation. And this was something of an interesting character creation experience for me, because I went into this having a pretty good idea of what I was going to want and need my character to do from having seen the show. However, once I actually got into making the character, it became a little more difficult. Like, yeah, the punching and guns and lore, that was all pretty easy, but then when it comes to things like impersonating an FBI agent or a game warden or the regional manager of an IHOP, things were a little less clear. Like, presumably you use the covert skill for forging your documents and, disguising yourself as whoever it is you're impersonating, and then it does say that lies use the performance skill, but then is not really clear on which specialty of the performance skill that would fall under, and, I can figure it out. That's not the point. The point here is, and this is going to be kind of an ongoing theme here, not that I need dedicated rules for impersonating an official, but rather that it is a very important part of the show, and as such, it should be an important part of the game based on the show, but it is barely addressed at all. It is like one of the 3 main things that a hunter does. They check out the lore and find the case, they impersonate someone and do a little investigating, and then they kill the thing. And it just kind of seems like they felt that that middle part was not an important enough part of the experience to go into any depth on. And while on that topic, the selection of equipment that you have is also a little odd, because just looking at the melee weapons, they include staff, bayonet, and 3 kinds of sword. And in the 11 seasons I've watched of this show, yeah, I realized earlier I said that I watched the first 4 seasons, but that was just before cracking open the book. Since then I've watched, a little bit more. Point is, in all of those episodes I watched, I can only think of like 3 times that anyone used a sword, and 0 times that anyone used a staff or a bayonet. And then on the other side, they do not provide stats for a machete, a thing that people use on that show all the damn time. And before you go writing in the comments about how I can just use the stats for a sword for a machete, I shouldn't have to, because there are not swords in Supernatural and there are machetes, so I shouldn't have to be the one to put them in there. It should be the designers. Also, there is barely any mention of things like silver and iron blades or holy water, things that are very important, not just to the Supernatural show, but literally to the Supernatural game. Like, they have rules that involve those things, but those things are also not listed in the equipment section. Like, there is a note that offhandedly mentions iron and silver blades, but then if you were to pull up knife, there's no mention of it. I believe the flask mentions that you could put holy water in it, but if you're looking through the equipment, you don't find holy water. And yes, if you are a fan of the show Supernatural, you are likely to know that these are things that your hunter will need for their hunting activities, and even if they are not listed in the equipment section, you may ask your game master about them. But if you are not that familiar with the source material, you might see them offhandedly mentioned, but then not really listed in the equipment section and just go, I probably don't need those. Clearly the chainsaw is more important because that is listed in the equipment section. And moving on, I do also have a slight issue with the everything listed as dice situation they have going on, because yeah, it works for your attributes and your skills, but then when you get into the assets, it gets a little wacky, because regardless of how useful or useless a particular asset might be, the price per bonus is always going to be the same. So adding a d6 to all rolls made to use, make, acquire, or analyze technology, just all technology, costs the same as adding a d6 to all rolls involving balance. And just because of the way it's set up, the system cannot value one bonus higher or lower than another because the cost is always equal to the bonus. And with some of the assets, they don't even use dice, but they still have a dice cost. So like there are d4 abilities that do not involve a d4 in any way. They just cost a d4, but it's not a d4, it's just 4 points. And overall it just kind of feels like they decided that this was a major feature instead of just like a stylistic one and refused to change it in any way. And yeah, I've been very negative in this part of the review, so I will say something nice. I do very much like the way that the skills are structured, where you have the general skills that you take up to a certain level and then specialize past then. It helps you get from useless to capable pretty easily, but then specialize from there instead of having to take every single skill from 0. So a 3 out of 6 for character creation. It is a serviceable character creation system, perhaps even a good character creation system. It just does not feel like they put very much effort into tailoring it to the source material. Supernatural role-playing game uses the Cortex system, and I think might actually be the last game to use the original Cortex system. Anyway, as you may recall, our attributes and skills are defined by dice, so when we want to do a thing, we roll a relevant attribute and skill die and compare it to a difficulty. So let's say that our character wants to hack into someone's computer. We would roll a d8 for their intelligence, plus a d4 for their tech skill, and another d4 for their tech expert trait. Then add those together and compare the result to the difficulty. Let's just say it's average, which is 7. However, if that computer just happened to be, like, crawling with spiders, we would also add a d4 from our phobia trait to the difficulty, and those are the basic mechanics. And there's also complex actions, which are basically the same as regular actions, except that instead of a difficulty, they have a threshold. The difference being a threshold is much higher, and instead of being pass-fail, your rolls just kind of chip away at the threshold until you surpass it. And combat is also basically the same. As you saw, all of the combat skills are just regular skills like everything else and are rolled just like everything else. There are, however, some additional rules, as there often are in these games. Alright, so let's say that our hunter has encountered a deadly shapeshifter who decides to attack with Fist Punch, rolling a d10 for their strength and d4 for unarmed combat. And let's say that our hunter decides to block, rolling a d8 for our agility plus a d2 for our unarmed combat skill. Then we subtract the defense total from the attack total to get the initial damage, which is 5. And this is basic damage, which is then split evenly between our stun and wound damage, favoring stun. So 5 points of basic damage translates to 3 points of stun and 2 points of wound. And basically the way this whole situation works is if total damage, that is combined stun and wound, exceeds life points, a character must begin making saves to avoid falling unconscious. If wound damage reaches half life points, all the character's attribute dice are reduced by 2 steps. If wound damage reaches total life points, the character risks dying. And if the wound damage reaches double the character's life points, straight up immediate death. And I am going into this much depth on it because it will be relevant later. Anyway, let's say that we decide to retaliate with a shotgun blast, rolling agility plus shotgun, and then the shapeshifter rolls agility plus athletics to dodge. Then once again we subtract the defense from the attack to get the initial damage, which is then split between stun and wound as normal. However, as this is a weapon attack, it also deals an additional 1d10 wound damage. I assume. Anyway, as supernatural creatures, shapeshifters heal supernaturally fast, healing 1 point of stun every minute and 1 wound every hour, versus the normal human rate, which is basically 1 stun per hour and 1 wound per 2 days. Once again, this is a thing that is about to be relevant. And of course, as on the show, shapeshifters are vulnerable to silver, so if we were to shoot one with a silver bullet, it wouldn't do any extra damage or anything like that, but does have to be noted separately because the silver damage heals at the normal human rate instead of the accelerated shapeshifter rate. And that is the only difference. So silver really only is going to matter if you're fighting a very extended battle over the course of hours or more like days. Otherwise, shapeshifters go down about as easy as any normal human. But enough about shapeshifters. This is early Supernatural, and you want to know about ghosts, as they are the subject of many of the best episodes from the early seasons. Ghosts have no physical ability scores and no life points because they are dead. So obviously they cannot be harmed with physical attacks, although they can harm you with their own spirit attacks. And just like in the show, they are vulnerable to iron and salt, so if we were to say shoot one with our rock salt shotgun, which they generally don't try to dodge in the show, so let's just assume they don't do that in the game and make it an easy task, the ghost will be dissipated for 1d6 rounds, which is hopefully long enough to find salt and burn the bones. So overall, a pretty good job adapting the ghosts from the show to the game. And that is pretty much it. The basic mechanics here are fairly simple and elegant. In fact, so simple and elegant that I accidentally created the same basic mechanics for Cosmic Hooligans with no knowledge of this system. Then someone told me about that, and I was a little annoyed. Regardless, obviously, I like the ideas here. Having a die for your attribute and a die for your skill feels a little bit weightier than just adding 2 numbers to a die roll, or adding 2 numbers together and then rolling that many dice. You literally have an attribute and a skill thing that you roll. It is, overall, a good role-playing game system. The issue being that it very much feels like a role-playing game system, not the Supernatural role-playing game system. Like, the only part of the mechanics that feels specifically tailored to Supernatural is the special rules for the various monsters that you might encounter. And even then, it feels kind of like, okay, I guess we have to do this, but, let's not push it too far. As I went through the trouble of explaining earlier, you could pretty much just beat a shapeshifter to death with a rock if you had to, or wanted to. And aside from ghosts that they actually, put some good effort into, most of the other monsters are more or less handled the same. Well, I guess demons are okay too, but there are some issues with the way they presented demons. It just kind of feels like they thought the monsters as they appeared in the show were way too strong, so, they toned them down a bit, but then also that their weaknesses were too strong, so they toned those down too, and it just ends up being weaker monsters that aren't really that vulnerable to the thing they are supposed to be vulnerable to. And I think the most egregious example of this is the vampire. In the world of Supernatural, a vampire is nearly impervious to damage and can only be killed by cutting off their head, which is usually presented as a thing that happens when you get a lucky opening in the midst of battle, or you're clever and you sneak up on them while they're sleeping and chop off the head, or, something dramatic like that. But in the game, if you want to decapitate a vampire, you need to make a called shot at the neck, which increases the difficulty of the roll by 8, and even if you make that, you still need to do enough damage with that attack to raise their total wounds up to the normal death threshold. And if you're going to try to do this to a sleeping vampire, or one that was otherwise unaware or helpless, the base difficulty would be 3, plus that 8, making it 11. And also, as stated, you need to deal enough damage to actually kill them, and they're probably at full strength while they're sleeping, so that's not a thing you're going to be able to do, even if you make that very difficult check, because in the system, 11 is a really high difficulty. Like, based on the stats they provide in the book, Dean Winchester has a 21% chance of making that check. And Sam, literally 0. He does not have high enough skills to attempt to decapitate a sleeping vampire. So even if you make this moderately difficult roll, you are still unlikely to actually kill the vampire unless you've already softened them up a bit first, because they can take regular damage just like anyone else, they just heal it much faster. And it is specifically stated that they can be knocked out from taking damage, so when you're fighting vampires in this game, the smart option is just to pump them full of rounds until they fall down, then saw off their head at your leisure. Which is, slightly less badass than, charging in and lopping off heads or sneaking up to someone and, cut off their head while they're sleeping, but it's like the best you can do in this game, and it's just, slightly less exciting. So another 3 out of 6 for mechanics. It is a fine system, a good system, a system that I personally like. It just also feels like they put in the bare minimum amount of effort into making it the Supernatural role-playing game system. So, as alluded to earlier, there is a selection of content in this game. More specifically, a selection of content that leaves you wanting or expecting more than is provided. There was some thought put into traits that reflected the world and characters of Supernatural, but then when we get to the equipment, large amounts of a hunter's equipment and arsenal are just kind of missing, which is a big deal. And as I've said before, they are things that are mentioned, but then just not given any attention in the book, and it feels like that's the way they handle a lot of things. For example, rituals, including exorcisms, which are, kind of important things in Supernatural, are mentioned occasionally, but never really specified how they work. They do perform a ritual in the example of play, which is just a scene from Phantom Traveler, but never at any point do they stop and say, here is how you perform a ritual, specifically an exorcism to exorcise a demon in supernatural role-playing game. That was what I was saying earlier about the rules for demons being lacking. That is an important part of how demons function in Supernatural. And as I keep saying, the issue is not that there need to be some kind of special rules for rituals. The issue is that it is an important aspect of the show and should be an important aspect of the game, deserving of at least some note. The selection of supernatural foes also leaves a bit to be desired. Most of the attention is given to ghosts and demons, which, fair, they are important things for the show, and they did a pretty good job with ghosts, and I voiced my issues with demons earlier. But what they provide for shapeshifters, Striga, vampires, wendigos, and zombies is very minimum. And there is a whole expansion that adds lots of other spooky monsters to the game, but that just kind of makes me feel like, were they intentionally leaving them out of this book so they could put them in that book? Because the selection here is kind of lame. Admittedly, the selection of monsters in the early seasons of Supernatural was also kind of lame, but they could have put, changelings in. Changelings were way more interesting than Striga. They also provide stats for mundane animals and, assorted persons, which kind of makes you wonder when in your Supernatural role-playing game you are going to need stats for a bird of prey, a shark, a child, or an evening hookup. And as I said, this book came out after the end of Season 4, and I realize these things take time, so they would not have had the time to put all of the stuff from Season 4 into the book. But here's the thing, is they do have little references to a major element that was added to the Supernatural lore in Season 4, so they were definitely adding stuff to the book from Season 4, so they could have added more from Seasons 4 and 3, because it really feels like they are focusing almost entirely on the first two seasons, specifically the first season. And for my one good thing, they do also provide a moderate amount of information on the Supernatural verse, the various regions of the country that you'll be traveling around, the concepts and just life of a hunter, that sort of stuff, locations and, little things about oh, here's how you can use this location in your game. So they do provide you with some useful supernatural stuff for the game. It's just feels like it is separate from the actual game material. There is supernatural stuff and there is game stuff, but they're not together. So no adjustment for content. They give you everything you need to play the game. It just feels like they weren't trying very hard to provide you with everything that you would need for the best possible supernatural role-playing game experience. Overall, the book is written okay. Everything is more or less explained well, and there is something of an attempt to write things in a hey there, I'm a cool dude sort of way, which does have a tendency to have a bit of a how do you do fellow kids feel to it, which it does here. And as mentioned earlier, there is a fair amount of the book that is just the core text system, core rules with a few words changed here and there. Although I will say, if I had to pick anything as this book's strong point, it is definitely the layout. It does a pretty good job of feeling like a weather journal filled with random photos and notes taped or stapled or just paperclipped in. I also really like the use of photographic elements, which is a thing I'd really like to see more of, especially in horror games. Although, it does go a little over the top at times and can feel a bit like a mid-90s adventure game, which personally is an aesthetic that I'm super into, so no adjustment for writing. It is fine. It's as unimpressive as most of the rest of the game, and 5 out of 6 for presentation. This thing looks really nice, and It seems like this is where most of the actual effort went in this book. And there we have it. Supernatural role-playing game. A basic reskin of the Cortex system, which very much feels like it. It doesn't really feel like it has that much to offer for either the Supernatural fan looking for a gaming experience, or an experienced gamer looking for a unique game. Of the two, I would say that the Supernatural fan would get the most out of it, but that is just in it being a supernatural role-playing game. And overall, it just ends up feeling kinda generic, which for a licensed game is one of the worst things you can be, because like, being based on supernatural is this game's main selling point, and if it doesn't do that well, it's kind of a failure. And personally, I like the Cortex system, but if you really liked the D20 system, I would have a really hard time trying to come up with a reason why this game would provide you with a better supernatural role-playing game experience than D20 Modern. And I don't like D20 Modern very much, which is quite unfortunate because Supernatural does feel like the sort of thing that could actually have crossover success as a role-playing game, provided that role-playing game was good, because the general concept of Supernatural, it fits a role-playing game really well. Unfortunately, this role-playing game did not fit that concept. So I guess if you happen to be a fan of Supernatural and are interested in these tabletop role-playing games that the kids are talking about, this might be something interesting to check out, as long as you don't expect too much from it. However, if you are not already a fan of the show, there isn't that much here for you versus, pretty much any other modern dark fantasy game. And that is all my thoughts on Supernatural role-playing game, and thank you for watching, with extra special thanks to my Fight and Flail Snails, Samuel Gorski, Randy Mulholland, and Toshiro Kuro. If you want to be cool like them, you can check out my Patreon, where you can get early access to videos and fun stuff that I make for the Patreon. But if you don't want to do that, that's cool too. You can still hit all of the lovely buttons, like, subscribe, these other videos that either myself or the YouTube algorithm have lovingly selected for you, which I am sure are lovely videos that you will also enjoy. And I will see you next time.